Another fascinating talk given by Dr. Dan Lyons, who's already been mentioned as the Chief Executive Officer of the Centre for Animal Social Justice, which is sponsoring today's event. He's an honorary research fellow at the University of Sheffield. He's the author of the books many of you may know, The Politics of Animal Experimentation. He's also the author of Diaries of Despair of 2000, a report that reproduced and analysed leaked documents about pig-to-primate organ transplants. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Dr. Lyons. We very much look forward to hearing.
Thanks, James. Yeah, first of all, thank you to James, Ben, and his colleagues at the Schweitzer Institute for doing the majority of the work to organise this conference. So huge thanks to them, and huge thanks to all the speakers today, and for all of you here for coming to participate in the conference, and also the people online as well. So I thought both John Knowles and Jonathan Hoffman's talks were fascinating, and Jonathan Hoffman was talking about, he's coming from the kind of political philosophy angle and political theory angle, looking at the sort of, well, in an ideal world, how would other animals be represented? I suppose over the years, and I'll explain in a minute, I've kind of travelled from that focus more to the trying to figure out what's happening with the status quo focus, to understand that. So I think that's key if we're going to understand how we're going to make any progress towards the ideal, as it were. So I'll the title of my talk is very similar to Jonathan and others as well. So let's go. That's the abstract. That's quite. So yeah, I'll use my experience, my journey, to give you a kind of summary of the rationale behind the Centre for Animals and Social Justice. So as James mentioned, I began many years ago as a student at Sheffield University first, and then a campaigner. And I suppose my disciplinary interest is in politics, but it's also focused on the ethical arguments around cruelty to animals and issues of animal rights, etc. So I was working at a campaign group called Uncaged in the mid-1990s. At that point, I was trying to do a PhD part-time, looking at the relationship between animal rights ethics and environmental political theory and ethics. And that's why John Knowles' discussions were really fascinating, and I broadly agree with a lot of that. And I remember reading stuff by people like J. Baird Callicott and others who were trying to grapple with the idea of, does intrinsic value reside with systems or individuals, or both, or is intrinsic value the wrong route at all? So it's really fascinating stuff, and in a way that's kind of, I'd like one day to go back to that. I've got some hypotheses about Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was an existential phenomenologist, and his concepts of the le corps propre, the body subject, and the idea of motor intentionality as one way of trying to figure out what it is about individual living beings that kind of gives them intrinsic value. Anyway, so slight diversion there, but yeah, really fascinating, and it deserves a lot more attention. So anyway, yeah, I started off kind of more interested in the kind of political theory and ethics side. But experience is a cruel teacher. What I think many of us found, the more that you try to lobby MPs and government, and the more you start to look at what's actually happening on the ground to animals, the more you appreciate that moral arguments, although they are, of course, a necessity, are normally far from sufficient as a means of achieving real change for animals. And there's often a large gap between the letter of the law and the impression that one is given by regulators and industries, a large gap between that and what's actually really happening to animals in the wild, on farms, in laboratories, etc. And I suppose that kind of growing awareness of the real situation culminated in the leaks of documents that James mentioned that our group received back in 2000 and I think 2001, which related to a large project of pig to primate organ transplant experiments that took place not far from here at Huntington Life Sciences and were commissioned and run by a company here in Cambridge called Imitran, who were later bought out by Novartis. And looking at that and the subsequent court battle and political battle to get justice was, a real eye-opener. And perhaps the most eye-opening aspect of the whole affair was the, to be frank, cynical dishonesty on the part of the Home Office as they tried to cover up the various breaches of regulations and tried as hard as possible to do nothing about it. So, in other words, the animals were not even given the partial level of consideration and protection that one might imagine from reading the law and regulations. And I'll go off on a slight but relevant tangent here. Jonathan mentioned that one of the forms of representation is the notion of consideration. And then I thought his quote from Robin Eckersley about her trying to speak up for the parrots, all she could really say was that she cared about the parrots. And I think the penny has kind of dropped this morning. One of the things that I've noticed and is a really strong kind of political tactic is that a lot of the industries that are involved in causing harm to animals use this discourse in order to try and give the impression that they deeply consider and care for animals. And obviously, in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that, a lot more compromised than that. And they use that, but they're pretending or exaggerating the idea that they are representing the animals. And therefore, perhaps we shouldn't listen to these extremist animal protection people with their emotional arguments. Don't worry, leave it to us. We know what we're doing. We care about them. Anyway, I'll as I go on, you'll see more now. But it's just interesting how that, I think the way Jonathan articulated it helped really sort of focus my mind on how that is such a powerful tactic and how it's used to the detriment of animals. So anyway, yeah. So when you see how the illegitimate and brutal exercise of power can have such a dramatically negative impact on animals, I think then there's a motivation there to really want to address these more empirical questions about why this situation has come to pass, because only then we know what the effective remedies might be. So at that point, I switched the focus of my PhD to try and understand and explain UK animal research policy, and now with the assistance of unique primary data relating to actual policy outcomes. So in other words, the clinical observations made by the researchers and technicians of the monkeys and baboons as they were dying in the experiments. And also some really interesting stuff, the letters between the Home Office inspectors and the researchers, and some of the references at the time to the advisory committee and how they would be manipulated to have a more favourable view of the project. So on the back of that, I wrote my thesis and then the book that is there actually. Yeah, so that's the story that we got out. So yeah, we won the court case in the end because our argument was that the document showed that not just the researchers were guilty of wrongdoing and misleading the public, but also the Home Office weren't doing their job. And we got to the point where we finally managed to get legal aid to afford professional representation against Novartis's lawyers. And at the beginning, Novartis has said in their witness statements that, so obviously we had all these clinical observations saying that the animals were in a terrible state. And they were saying, oh no, we've got these surgeons' notes, which paint a completely different picture. Okay. So then when we got to the disclosure point of the case, obviously we've said, well, you've said this in your witness statement, you now have to disclose all these surgeon notes that you claim contradict the clear impression given by the clinical observations, etc. And at that point, they seemed very keen to settle the case. And we ended up basically getting all the documents out that we had asked for in the first place 2.5 years later. We had to go through the process of being obviously, I was sued personally by Imitran and Novartis because they know if you just sue the company, well, the company can disappear. We can start again. There's no huge tragedy. But if they're suing me personally, obviously, there's a lot more pressure on myself, and my wife and I would just bought our first house together. We would be made bankrupt, etc. And I think their bills were like hundreds of thousands just within the first few months for their QC, etc. So yeah, we won in the end. So we thought, hey, we've got the bank to write this. Surely something's going to happen. But as I said, the Home Office, they really dug their heels in. We kind of missed the chance to do a judicial review. We didn't have the money for it either. We went to the only option we had was the parliamentary ombudsman. And then this was a real insight into how the kind of wider context that you're dealing with, the wider political culture and their views. That was a real eye-opener because they ended up rejecting our contention because one of the sort of most blatant breaches was where animals, they were found dead. And these were animals that were on moderate severity limit experiments. And the definition of those is that they were supposed to be stopped before the animals suffered like systemic illness. And obviously in 17 cases, the experiments have been allowed to continue way beyond that. So that was the most kind of blatant example. It's called, in the regulations, it's called death as the end point. Okay. And it's in the regulations, and people involved in animal experimentation know that that's kind of the most severe experiments generally you can get. So that was our kind of key point. Now, in the end, the parliamentary ombudsman, they rejected our argument because they said that, as far as they were aware, death in itself was not a harm. Okay, so and it's like, well, hang on, that's not what we're saying. It's a really obvious misunderstanding of the situation, and we'd heard sort of on the grapevine that the Home Office had tried to run this argument in court in a judicial review that the BUAV, as they were then called, were running. So we figured out where the parliamentary ombudsman had picked up this line from, and at the same time they said, "Oh, we think your grievance here is against animal experimentation in general and not just this particular case." And it's like, obviously, we've been very, very careful indeed to focus on the facts of the case rather than make any. So, obviously, they were going out of their way to shut it down. Anyway, I'll come back to that in a second. So this is like the Imitran thing was a critical case study, but I was trying to understand the history of UK animal research policy to understand it. And one of the tools that you need to do that is to look at the interest groups and their policy belief systems. Now, I found that this typology, which is based on one by a bioethicist called Barbara Orlands, it corresponds remarkably well to the reality of the debate in the UK over the last more than 150 years now, since before the 1876 Cruelty to Animals Act. So actually, there are two political positions or ideologies here that are practically relevant. And that's first of all, the animal use, it's called. I think it's probably a slight misnomer. I suppose it kind of describes the industries, but I suppose from our perspective, it's not so much the use that's the issue, it's the harm, it's the pain and suffering. But anyway, that's how Barbara Orlands called it. So animal use, it's the belief system adopted by animal use interests in farming and experimentation, etc. And part of this belief system is that animal welfare is heavily subordinate to commercial or professional interests. And there's a wide definition of tolerated or necessary suffering. And the policy aims that I found through the history of these groups is that their really main aim is to promote self-regulation and prevent animal welfare considerations restricting their activity. And then the second position that's been the other one, kind of involved in the battle, as it were, is animal welfare. And in this position, animal welfare should be given considerable weight in a kind of utilitarian calculus. And it's a position that kind of corresponds to most of the general public, and it's the policy position adopted by most animal protection organisations. When I mean policy position, it's the position they use when they're trying to affect public policy. And the policy aims here are generally tied to public regulation to introduce some ethical and democratic considerations into our treatment of animals, greater accountability, etc., etc. So it's kind of, yeah, trying to sort of democratise areas where animals are at risk against the kind of more closed shop private approach. And of course, there is a third philosophical position, animal rights, which you're probably all familiar about. However, in kind of lobbying terms, groups with this core philosophical position tend to argue along animal welfare lines in order to have some kind of impact, because the political and cultural systems that they work in marginalise and denigrate the animal rights position. And as a little example of this, I stood for election as an RSPCA councillor 8 or 9 years ago now. And some of you might be aware that every time there's an RSPCA election, the Daily Mail, the Times and the Telegraph run a story trying to discredit trustees that they see as extreme. Mainly because I think their main thing is the close links with hunting and shooting interests, and their executives are like that with them. So they've got a real bee in their bonnet. And yeah, that I was accused of being an animal rights extremist because they claim that I think that people who want to have pets or own companion animals, they should have to pass a test to make sure that they're proficient and not psychopaths to do it, which I don't think makes me an extremist. I think most people probably would think that's and we used to have dog licenses once upon a time, not that they were strict in that sense. So there was that. And then the other thing that they tried to use to label me as an extremist was wanting parliamentary representation for animals, which was a kind of misreading of our general idea of political representation. But it was interesting that they were trying to dig out things to make me seem an extremist, and that was what they came up with. But yeah, it shows how desperate they are. So yeah, and it's an example of how, even though you can get an MP or stand up in Parliament and say, I'm for animal rights, when they're not really, or they're a little bit. And yet, you've got certain kind of interests trying to really marginalise it. So anyway, interesting little case. So in reality, in the politics of this, the front line in the struggle is between animal use and animal welfare belief systems. And in the UK, at least, the predominant government approach is animal use, which, as I've said, is in tension with the public's more progressive general sort of animal welfare position. So I'll try and explain why this is the case, which I guess is kind of part of my academic background and the rationale for our centre, and then hopefully look at some solutions out of that. So the animal research policy area is a classic example of how government and animal use interests resist public opinion and animal welfare through what's called the politics of symbolic reassurance, combined with the institutionalised exclusion of animal welfare interests. Trying to think who I got the politics. I think Ada one. Anyway, it's will be referenced in my book. But yeah, it's the politics of symbolic reassurance is a broad political phenomenon, but it's very, I think it's particularly prominent in animal welfare issues. So 1986 was what we might call a critical juncture in the evolution of this policy area, with new legislation that at first sight seemed to introduce an ideological change from animal use to animal welfare. And this was through the introduction of a cost-benefit assessment for research projects. In other words, regulators and animal researchers could now say that animal harm was assessed and considered before a project could be authorised. However, there were and still are critical gaps in the regulations that have the potential to erode the impact of animal welfare consideration. So one of the issues here is that the relative weight to be given to animal pain and suffering versus expected benefits in the cost-benefit assessment it's never been defined in law, which basically allows the government and researchers almost universal discretion in how this was implemented. And to give you an example of this, for 10 years, they would still license the toxicity testing of cosmetic and cosmetics ingredients on animals, which is a pretty clear example of how the cost-benefit assessment was operated in an extremely biased way. And also, one of the other things that didn't change was the fact that there was no real changes to the implementing body, the inspectorate, which continued to be largely drawn from the animal research profession, or at least sharing close professional links. So you've still got this strong cohesion between implementers and regulators, which is a classic example of a closed, non-responsive, what's called a policy community in the policy network analysis literature. And another aspect of the legislation was Section 24, which was supposed to prevent any unofficial disclosure of information about regulation and research outcomes. And that has allowed research interests to influence public understanding of animal research and its regulation. So they're able to say that people care about animals, there's no, almost give the impression that there's no suffering at all involved. But without hard primary evidence, it's has been difficult to counter that in a credible way. So going back to the Imitran case project, so we had two leaks, one that we think came from either Imitran or Huntington Life Sciences, and then another one that we think came from the Home Office. Now, in particular, the Home Office ones, because we actually got the project license documents, which are normally highly confidential. But what they showed was that 95% of Imitran's experiments were classed as moderate, as I said before. The only ones that were classed as severe were the heart experiments, or some of the heart transplants on baboons, where the baboon's own heart was removed. So they did two types of heart transplants, one where the heart was left in place and the new heart was put into the abdomen, because the main aim there was to test the immunological reaction rather than its ability to support life. But they also did a few dozen where they actually put an orthotopic transplantation where it was a clinical straight swab. So the vast majority were moderate, and both in the guidance and in the kind of humane endpoints that are written into the project license, moderate means it's supposed to have limited adverse effects. The animals were supposed to be sacrificed or euthanized before serious systemic illness and death occurred. Now, on the benefit side of the equation, they were saying, and some of you might remember this in the press at the time, they were claiming that they were probably going to be able to start putting pig hearts into people within a year. And in turn, this benefit prediction was based on a deeply flawed scientific case in the application regarding the immunological and physiological barriers to pig organ transplant. So the researchers were basically saying, we think, so they'd overcome the very first, or they thought they'd overcome the very first rejection process, which was hyperacute rejection, by genetically manipulating the pigs so that they expressed the protein on the cells, which kind of stopped the first wave of immunological attack when you put an organ from a different set species into primates. But that's only the first wave of rejection. They were saying, well, we think the other waves of rejection are going to be pretty similar to a normal human-to-human transplant. And there was already stuff in the literature saying this is very unlikely to be the case because you've got so many differences between pig organs immunologically and the human system. But anyway, clearly an inspectorate appeared to accept that claim. So yeah, that's what they were claiming. Now, the actual policy outcomes, so these are, say, some of the verbatim quotes from the monkeys. So there was a number of issues that they faced. First of all, there was the issues caused by the rejection of the organs. Probably just as bad, if not worse, was the toxicity from the drugs, because they were, instead of using, and this was another issue with the research program, instead of using combinations of immunosuppressants that were already knew that would be tolerated in humans, and with some tweaks by the macaques and baboons. They were using much higher levels of immunosuppressants to try and stop the rejection of these the pig organs. And the other thing was, so having started the project in late '94, I think, it actually went on until 2000, and they failed to even understand the subsequent rejection processes, never mind overcome them. So I think the fact that, maybe not just the fact that the Home Office authorised the Immutran research in the first place. I mean, I can kind of understand why they might think it's worth a go. But worse is the fact they allowed it continue, even after quite clearly very soon it wasn't conforming to the scientific case that Immutran had claimed. So they allowed it to carry on and on and on. And I think really that illustrates the reality of the UK government's animal use approach behind the animal welfare veneer. So this case is what's known in political science as a critical case study, which means it's highly likely to be representative of the wider pattern of regulation. So let me put that another way. It's a critical case study, maybe this is a better way to explain it, because it would be like this: if they can't regulate this case properly, then that doesn't give much hope for the thousands of mice and rats used in toxicology experiments, etc. And because this was using wild-caught primates, which I don't think they've used wild-caught primates since in the UK, and also this was given probably the highest levels of scrutiny by the advisory committee than any other project since the '86 Act was brought in. So yeah, so that's why it's a particularly useful case study. And another crucial methodological approach to understanding all policy areas actually is to take a longitudinal approach to see how the policy process evolves over time. And I mean, obviously this is since the kind of end of the subsequent political battle. This is almost 20 years ago. But sort of since then, there have been no major or paradigm level changes in this policy area. So the secrecy clause, section 24, is still in place despite numerous attempts and almost like quite a strong consensus that it should be repealed, but it's still there, again, despite recommendations from the advisory committee. And another interesting thing was when the 2010 EU directive in this field was being transposed into UK legislation, that appeared to weaken the legal requirements for researchers to conform to the severity stipulated in the project licence. And obviously, what we'd found and embarrassed both Immutran, Novartis and the Home Office was all these quite clear breaches of the moderate severity limit. And so effectively what the Home Office has done was they kind of got rid of the strict requirement to stick to the severity assessment as a limit. So that the lesson learned by the government from this affair was not to apply limits to animal suffering more diligently, but rather to abolish the limits to avoid any legal and political embarrassment. That's an example of what's called of dynamic conservatism. So one of the things try and understand policy process and political history is that nothing's ever static. Everything's always kind of moving and reacting against each other. And often what happens with governments, if they're trying to maintain a long-term position, they can't just say nothing and do nothing. They have to adjust to pressures. And this was an example of that, change to keep everything the same pretty much. So I mentioned the Animal Procedures Committee, which was the advisory committee in place at the time. And actually another aspect of the 1986 Act that made it look like it might signal change to a more animal welfare friendly position was the establishment of this body, and the law guarantees some animal welfare representation. However, now, as far as I can see, there is no animal welfare protection representation on its successor, the Animals and Science Committee. As far as I'm aware, Penny Hawkins, who's speaking later, she was the last kind of animal welfare protection representative. I think there's now a philosopher, a vet, and all the rest seem to be involved in bioscience. So on the face of it, yeah, it looks even less animal protection friendly than before. And on probably perhaps the most key aspect of the legislation is the operation of the cost-benefit assessment, or what's called now the harm-benefit assessment. And the Animal Science Committee published a report on the harm-benefit assessment in 2017. The government took 2.5 years to respond to the report, and they said that they accepted all the recommendations. But on what I think is the key one, which is the one the need to incorporate societal concerns, the government's response was actually pretty vague, and then along the lines of, well, we already do that and we'll carry on, blah, 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 blah. So all in all, no major changes in this sector. So I'll do a brief summary of farm animal welfare policy area. So there was a the historic Bramble report commissioned in '65, which was into the kind of the emerging area of factory farming animals, and that sort of was the first official report that really focused minds on the impact of intensive farming. Now, about 40 or 50 years later, the Farm Animal Welfare Committee, the advisory body there, observed that severe welfare problems remain unresolved because, in effect, economic and business interests are still being allowed to inflict gratuitous levels of suffering on hundreds of millions of animals. So again, this is an area where not much changed, despite there being awareness of the need to change. To illustrate this area, I want to talk about a court case that was brought against the government by CIWF in the mid-2000s. Now, what this did was challenge the use of fast-growing genotypes on the grounds that they inevitably caused chronic hunger in breeding birds. So the breeding flock, the chickens farmed for meat, if they grow so quickly, these genotypes, that if the breeders were allowed to feed freely, they wouldn't survive until sexual maturity, which takes 3 to 4 times longer than it takes to reach slaughter weight. So in order to allow the breeding flock to breed, you have to restrict their diet to 1/2 or less of what they would eat ad libitum, sometimes as little as 20% for much of their lives. And this causes severe welfare problems in itself because it causes chronic hunger and stress. And that was the argument. And if you look at the law, so the relevant clauses in the EU law in force at the time, the EU is saying that farm animals must be fed a wholesome, healthy diet to maintain good health and satisfy their nutritional needs, and no genotype should be developed and used, which has detrimental effects on animals' health or welfare. And the UK implementing regulations said that farmers must take all reasonable steps, and I think reasonable steps is probably the weakness there, but we'll say, take all reasonable steps to ensure that the conditions under which the animals are bred or kept, comply with these requirements, and the animals be fed sufficient food to promote a positive state of well-being. Therefore, the farming of fast-growing types of chicken appears to breach EU and UK laws, which on the face of it seem to ban unnecessary suffering. And hence it kind of gives the public the impression that there are at least some meaningful controls on cruelty. And so Compassion's case was the only way to comply with the law is to avoid rearing fast-growing types of bird and to instead use slower-growing chickens so that the breeding birds would not be chronically hungry. So this is an example of where the English courts have had to consider the government-created gap between the consensus that animals should not be caused to suffer for trivial economic reasons and the reality of the continued existence of systems that are guilty of precisely that. However, the the judiciary sided with the government and rejected Compassion's case. And this was because the use of fast-growing genotypes had become standard industry practice. Therefore, the courts appeared to refuse to even considering whether they were unlawful. From this position, they inevitably went on to find that the restrictive feeding regime was not illegal, as a balance had to be arrived between mutually incompatible welfare concerns. So this is where going back to the reasonable steps text. So it's the interpretation of reasonable steps, which is quite discretionary and subjective, really. And there's lawyers here with greater knowledge of this than me, but judges are not always, and maybe there's some good reasons for this, they're not always going to be keen to second guess ministerial interpretations of the law. And so, I mean, I think that's one of the core reasons why reasonable steps was interpreted to include not to completely overhaul the industry. So, in other words, the rule of law in this instance is fundamentally undermined because its implementation becomes entirely conditional on institutionalised business practice. And the ideology of maximising productivity and profit is the dominant idea. So I think, and there's been, before I go on to the next slide, there's been a couple of more court cases recently where the same thing's happening. So I think there was a judicial review or some challenge to the practice of carrying chickens by their legs, which is known as high risk of injury to them. And the case was actually won on that. So what the government has done is changed the law to explicitly allow that to happen. Again, another example of dynamic conservatism. And I think I'm not sure whether it's finished yet, but there's another case going on. So one of the other major aspects of fast-growing birds is just the huge problems with lameness, ascites, which is where, because they grow so quickly, basically the hearts can't support the body, so they end up with getting fluid filled in. It's genuinely horrific. And then you get other problems if they can't walk, they can't get to the feeding stations, they die of hunger and thirst. So again, that you would think if you're not supposed to breed and use genotypes that cause suffering, but we will see. I'm not sure if Edie's here yet. She may be able to talk to that. But again, it's another example of where nothing major has changed in this policy area. So you can see over 20 odd years in these kind of the big areas of them, in terms of whether it's numbers and/or intensity of suffering, there's not been any significant change in the policy approach. So I think the key lesson here is that if animal advocates focus on particular policy areas without also trying to focus on structural changes, which are the underlying causes for this, the interpretation of the law and the lack of implementation, then even when you appear to have made some progress, you get a new law which seems to be a bit stricter here. Very often, you end up just falling back. In reality, you've not really got very far in terms of the impact on animals. So, trying to understand why does this implementation gap exist? So, in both cases, research and farm welfare policy, the law gives the impression of an animal welfare approach, while implementation results in in reality, an animal use paradigm. So the question is, why has this situation evolved? So I found that a useful explanatory concept from the policy analysis literature is the notion that policy evolves from the way interest groups and governments deploy and exchange their political resources. Now, resources here has a broad meaning. So it's not just financial wealth to spend on lobbying campaigns, fund politicians, wardrobes, whatever, but also includes qualitative and structural factors, such as helpful laws, supportive public opinion, knowledge and information. I mean, that's a key thing. Alignment with dominant elite values and government power distributions, and perhaps most importantly, perceived contribution to national economic prosperity. Now, the perceived value of a group's resources, now what I mean by perceived, I mean how actual government officials and politicians, the ones with the ultimate power to make the decisions, how they perceive the value of a group's resources in a particular policy area will depend on whether those resources contribute to that policy area's goals. Now, because the animal-related policy areas have come to be dominated by producer interests, effectively. Therefore, animal advocates' resources, such as supportive public opinion and ethical arguments for animal protection, have little purchase in these policy areas because public accountability and animal welfare are seen more as hindrances than a help by these policy-making communities. And this is one of the reasons why animal advocates in the UK generally lack significant influence and excessively harmful policy-making continues. Now, these UK policy areas are very unlikely to reform of their own accord. And so it would require a powerful external shock to change their structures from animal use to animal welfare. Now, classically, a change in governing party is one potential external shock. But one of the interesting features of these closed policy systems is that there is relative resistance to outside pressure, and therefore no paradigm level policy shifts in animal research or farming have occurred either after 97, 2010, or 2015. We will have to wait and see what impact this year's election will have. It's fair to say that the animal protection movement will probably always lack economic muscle relative to animal use industries, which in turn allows the animal use industries to dominate related scientific professions, research and technology activity, media relations, etc. And I think the overarching cause that links all of these policy systems, well, it's a government-wide problem, is the lack of structural, institutionalised representation for animal interests within government. And what that means is that animal protection has little in the way of effective resources to counteract animal harm interests. So, for example, if we go back to this slide, so alignment with dominant elite values and government power distributions. Now, I think part of that is that, I mean, certainly one of the things I noticed under New Labour was that very soon, and we see actually it's a historically recurring thing, you get this obsession with deregulation and red tape, this whole thing about trying to free up industry. And I think whichever government comes in, they always kind of say the same thing really on that. And and they end up coming up with like Cabinet Office, cross-government task force to deregulate, huge government machines devoted to this goal. And obviously the effect of that, especially when you've got the pharmaceutical industry, which is seen as the goose that lays the golden egg in terms of economic strategies and prosperity. The deregulation of the pharmaceutical industry, including its research practices, is seen as a no-brainer for economic growth from the government. Where there's not really anyone in there saying, well, what about the animal suffering, apart from outsiders, and obviously we have little influence within that government machine. So yeah, this lack of institutionalized animal representation is it's probably not not sufficient on its own to achieve change, but it's very likely to be a necessary condition for that change. Going back to the issue of resources, so thinking about resources, there are a few that could be, in theory, utilised to change these policy processes to counterbalance the power of animal harm interests. Now, one is public opinion, which I might come back to this in a little bit, but generally most surveys and deliberative democracy exercises show that where the public's position is more progressive on animal welfare than the policy reality. So public opinion could be brought to bear to help democratise policy processes. And ideally, this would involve the incorporation, and picking up Jonathan's point, this would involve the incorporation of deliberative democratic decision-making into animal policy spheres. And case studies, as I said, show that these produce decisions that are more sympathetic to animals' interests. One non-European example of this was the South Australia state government held a citizens' jury to look into how they should enact laws around what they call dog and cat management. And as you can imagine, the issue of cats in Australia is quite a big issue because of the impact on native animals. So that was a big issue. And the thing was, the jury, because it came out with recommendations that were probably a bit further than the politicians on the own would want to go. So it's given them the confidence to kind of go a bit further for animals than they would otherwise go. And obviously, if you've got a documented, independent, objective process to, not just an opinion poll, but a deliberative process that's giving positive recommendations, that's quite a sort of a powerful resource to persuade. So the other, as I mentioned, is question of wider government support. And as I've said, there's a huge amount of institutional and legal support for deregulation, etc., and nothing really for any animal welfare stuff. However, having said that, one of the potentially interesting and positive developments recently is the Animal Sentence Act and the committee that it created. And what that could amount to is a foot in the door for animal protection within the wider government machine. So it would be very interesting to see how that evolves. And the reform that our centre has been suggesting and others now has grown momentum is a kind of a souped up animal sentence committee, what we would call an animal protection commission, with much more resources and expanded remit, and that would act hopefully as a louder voice for animals and setting an animal protection agenda across the whole of government. So the absence of overarching laws that guarantee significant consideration for animal welfare means that animal welfare is almost always sacrificed when it conflicts with animal harm interests, economic growth, etc. So animals also need to be granted some overarching legal or political status in order for public policy to be less dominated by money and raw power rather than ethics and democratic accountability. And I think one of the things Jonathan also mentioned was the idea of policy impact assessments. Now, Jonathan rightly mentioned that there's not much evidence out there of what works in the animal sphere because not much has been done. So, but what we can do is look at kind of the latest spheres, so environment, equalities. I think there are some similarities in those areas. And often what you'll see is government setting up commissions to be a voice for those excluded, those marginalised interests within government. So we can kind of do some policy learning from other policy spheres, and we have to really, because like I said, there's very little to go on globally in animal welfare policy. Oh, yeah, there's one other kind of related to that is the question of targets. And again, if something matters to the government, they will set a target to try and concentrate the government machine's mind to achieving that. And even if you don't achieve the target, it will help organise activity towards that. So, I mean, there's everything, isn't there? There's obviously there's carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Every single area of government policy, there will be some targets that they're aiming at, except really animal welfare. Although again, we'll see what pans out on this. There are some moves now for the government to look at how they might put together a roadmap to reduce and eliminate animal experimentation, which is something I remember we called for Uncaged 20, 30 years ago. So yeah, if that's taken seriously and pushed through, then again, that's maybe that's an interesting development. So yeah, there's perhaps a glimmer of hope there. So I think another point on this is that because we're looking at kind of wider government and political issues, I think these kind of significant structural policy changes are, of course, difficult to achieve. And I think apart from perhaps the RSPCA, I don't think any one group is capable of achieving on their own. So I think this is an area where collaboration between animal protection organisations is probably essential to maximise our chances of achieving that. And I think on that note, one thing I've noticed over the last decade or so is a growing awareness and interest in these kind of structural issues rather than the kind of specific meso level policy issues which traditionally animal protection groups have called for. So previously, you come up whenever there's a general election, normally animal protection groups will come up with a list of specific policy asks. But until relatively recently, they've not looked at what the political government structures are required to facilitate those policy asks. And I think that's key. And I can understand why that's difficult, because obviously a lot of animal protection groups are registered charities and are rightly wary getting involved in even though political campaigning is on paper entirely legal for charities to do, it's hard sometimes because quite rightly probably charity law prevents kind of partisan positions being taken by charities, and that's probably a good discipline for charities anyway. But inevitably, when you're talking about politics, one party is going to be advocating policy A, which might be relatively negative for animals, and another party may be advocating policy B, which is better for animals, and they genuinely think that. It's not because of their wider opinions of the parties. So as soon as you get into political lobbying, there's always a danger of a implicit partisan, and we all know that there are interests and media outlets out there who are always looking to hammer animal charities and other charities for political campaigning. So I can understand why there's a sort of wariness to get into this more deeply political area. And also, to be frank, all charities are struggling for donations. And because it's a little bit, it's quite tangential, it's a harder sell to get donations than, look, this animal's suffering, stop it now, give us a fiver to do it. So, there are pressures, but I think it's unavoidable if we really had to make any significant progress. Okay, so going back towards the idea of another potential gain. So there's another EU, I think called the EU Welfare Quality Study, which is a set of deliberative democratic exercises in various EU countries where they really kind of drilled into public opinion on animal welfare and what it means. I mean, this is another thing that the term animal welfare is so elastic and fluid. That's another project to get involved in. But anyway, the public are basically, again, obviously way ahead of not just where the policy reality is, but one of the interesting things was that a lot of the scientists and vets involved, I hope I can explain this right, but they were less willing to, or the scientists who are involved would say, well, you've got this cause of suffering to this group of animals here, but if you give them this other bit here, which will make them a bit happier, like a bit of enrichment, that kind of offsets it. Now, the public weren't really prepared to accept that. They'd say, no, that doesn't really justify or negate the fact that this animal is suffering. So it's interesting that, and now maybe that's a particular feature of questions of science and then veterinary science in particular. But anyway, that's another good example of potential gains of democratizing animal policy. And the key figure there is that on the recommendations of these international citizens juries, basically 50% of EU farms would fail to comply with the recommendations that they put forward. So there's been various public opinion surveys on animal experiments, and looking at basically half of experiments would fail the public's position on cost benefit. And that's I think one of the main things there is the issue of basic research. So public aren't as tolerant of basic research if, by its very nature, there is no concrete kind of likely welfare outcome for people in terms of improved medicines. And that. I mean, obviously, and there is some truth to this that applied research relies on basic research, but at the end of the day, if you're doing a cost-benefit assessment, the probability of benefit is a really key thing. And again, I suspect that again it's a professional and cultural outlook, isn't it, between scientists and the lay public. But anyway, that's another example of where I think if the public did get involved in shaping and research policy, there would be a big loss. Outcome, and you can see, therefore, you can see why the industry prefers self-regulation and the exclusion of public accountability. And I suppose the little quote from a Luxembourg government official there sums it up quite well, I think. So this is a recent book that I had a chapter published in, and some of the research that we funded appeared in this book. And I suppose, in a way, the title and the content sum up this kind of movement over the last decade, perhaps a little bit more. Movement from the traditional tendency for us all, because the ethical arguments are so clear and obvious. You think, well, I'll just say it and everyone will be persuaded and it will all change. But after a while, you realise, it's power and interests probably matter even more. And so there's been an evolution in academic study in animals from the sort of more ethical, normative, theoretical side to some of the more kind of empirical stuff that we're doing. But there's an intrinsic relationship between the two, because obviously we look at the empirical stuff because we've got a normative position that we believe, and we think the public closer to us, and we think because of that we can do something in the real world. So the two are both essential. And this was edited by Professor Robert Garner from Leicester, who we funded, and also the late Siobhan O'Sullivan, who was a really major Australian academic. And she died last year, I think, last June. So just to finish off, just to give you a little summary of some of the research projects that we've funded. And Jonathan quoted one of the papers that Rob Garner put out from the funding that we did to look at animals and democratic theory. We funded a PhD at Sheffield with Lucy Parry, and she was looking at the hunting debate, looking at the discourses that were used by the various interest groups involved in hunting hounds and how that was reflected in Parliament and the media. And then we also funded an international comparative study that was looking at the regulation of chickens farmed from Australia, UK, New Zealand, and the Netherlands. Now, unfortunately, as I said, Siobhan's passed away, but Peter Chen is ongoing with that, and we've got a few more outputs from that. We're just about to agree a new study, and this actually chimes in with one of the things that Jonathan mentioned as well. So this has been, so now Lucy's she's gone really into the whole deliberative democracy area. And so she's working with a project called Participedia, which is like a collection and analysis of deliberative democratic exercises. Now, up to now, there's not been much focus on animals. So we're funding a project called Mapping Emerging Practices of Non-Human Representation and Participation. And hopefully and then we'll end up with a collection and analysis of these case studies on the Participedia website. And then that will be the basis for future research. So yeah, there's some big hitters in political science who are kind of involved in this network. And we're funding that through the University of Westminster. They've got, I think, democracy. And I think one of the things I've noticed is that in other disciplines, such as philosophy, law, mainly philosophy and law, actually the question of animals has been there I mean, perhaps not prominently, but it's been visible for quite a long time, and sort of political theory to an extent as well. You know, but not really very. I mean, very little in terms of actual political public policy analysis for animals, even though it is clearly an issue of huge political interest. And yeah, I wonder why it's not taken off that much within politics departments in the public policy side. So yeah, that's one of the things we're trying to, building up research capacity in this field is one of our aims. And so the project, this Mapping Emerging Practices project, is hopefully going to contribute to that as well. And also we have a research grants program for animal protection politics. So we're particularly interested in funding research in our kind of three areas, which are the idea of the Animal Protection Commission, or more broadly, how we institutionalise animal representation within government. The other areas, complementary to that, is deliberative democracy and participation generally. And then the other thing is the kind of animal welfare audit, which is about kind of measuring animal welfare outcomes, and then that kind of feeds into the idea of impact assessments, etc., etc. So yeah, and we've got money available to do that. So we're generally looking at UK-based academics, and our main policy is to look at funding teaching buyout, because that's the most kind of cost-effective way of funding research. So basically, we provide the money to allow an academic to get out of their teaching obligations, because you can hire a lowest pay level replacement for that and get a higher grade professor, whatever, to do the research. And actually, that's quite a common charitable way. We're not a multi-million pound research council, so that's quite a common way for charities in lots of different areas to fund academic research. So yeah, and we've got some information about that on our website. And finally, a little bit of key reading. So this covers the broader understanding of public policy and policy networks, as well as some of the specific things. So you'll see the Miller et al., that's one of the papers from the EU Welfare Quality Study, and the Ghana paper from our research that we funded there as well, and the link to the dog and cat jury in South Australia as well. So that's probably more than enough for me. So probably not even got time for questions. So unless I leave that up to Ben, actually. So anyway, thanks a lot. Thanks for listening and putting up with me.